So this is a quick tutorial for the GCSE Edexcel Paper 2 period study, and this example is for superpower relations and the Cold War. There are loads of different options that your teachers could have picked. So this exam that I'm going to talk through now is for the period study. There are 4 options shown on the screen here, and the one that I'm going to talk through is superpower relations and the Cold War. So if you've studied anything else, just stop the video because you'll be wasting your time. Your teachers have also taught you a depth study, which is on screen here, and in this exam you'll have 2 different exam papers in one sitting. So you'll have a 55-minute exam for whatever British depth study your teachers have chosen, and you'll have a 55-minute exam for the period study. No one will tell you stop this exam paper and start this one. You need to manage your time yourself. It's the same rule of thumb applies, so it's about 4 marks is 1 paragraph roughly, and this example is from 2021. So these questions are from the 2021 exam. So explain 2 consequences of the Tehran conference, 8 marks. Write a narrative account analysing the key events of the Second Cold War. And then explain 2 of the following. For purposes of this video, I will go through all 3, and this video will look at exam technique and content. So as you go through it, you should learn some things or revise some things as you're learning about exam technique. So for the explain 2 consequences, I always stick with make a point, give some evidence or some examples, explain those examples, and then link that all back to the question. I've given you some sentence starters here, and I'll show you how I use those sentence starters now. This is what the exam mark scheme looks like. So this is how the examiners mark this question, and really interestingly, examiners are almost told to treat this as 2 separate questions. So when I just said there are 2 different paragraphs, so 2 consequences, paragraph for consequence 1, paragraph for consequence 2. The examiner will read that and say, okay, is this a level 2 answer? Great, and then they'll read your second paragraph and say, is that a level 2 answer? And then they will give you a mark. So this is my example for this. So that remember, the question is explain 2 consequences of the Tehran conference. So I'll talk through my example now and then link it back to the mark scheme. So one of the consequences of the Tehran conference was an improvement in relations between Stalin and Roosevelt. This was attributed to the agreement reached to establish a second front in Europe, thereby relieving the Soviet Union from the burden of fighting a defensive war in the East. While Churchill was disgruntled by the decision, it was an illustration that tactical decisions were not driven by ideology alone. It was one of the few occasions in the Cold War when Stalin received agreement at the expense of a capitalist leader. And then I'm linking it back to the question now. Therefore, a significant consequence of the conference was a marked improvement in the relation between Stalin and Roosevelt. So if we take this back to the mark scheme, level 2 says features of the period are analysed to explain a consequence. So yes, a consequence has been explained. Specific information about the topic is added to support the explanation, showing good knowledge and understanding of the period. Yes, so an examiner would put this in at a level 2. Then when they would read this one separately and decide is it level 1 or level 2. So the second consequence of the Tehran conference was that the Grand Alliance agreed to protect Stalin's western border after World War II. Initially, they received an agreement to keep Germany in a weakened state. This measure was crucial in protecting Stalin's western border, since the Soviet Union had suffered 2 invasions by Germany in the past. This agreement reassured Stalin that his people would be shielded from the threat of another war. The USSR's western border was further protected, as it was agreed that the Soviet Union could retain the territories it had received from Poland, seized from Poland. Therefore, the second consequence was that Stalin received agreement from Roosevelt and that his borders would be safe. And it's really important to remember that this conference happened while World War II was still going on. So again, the examiner would put it in a level, okay, so give it level 2, and then hopefully they would pick 4 there. So 4 for the first one, 4 for the second one, 8 out of 8. So next exam question I think is really interesting. So again, I said as a rule of thumb, for every 4 marks, write 1 paragraph or 1 explanation. For this one, some teachers would say write 3, and I'll show you why in a moment. So the question is, write a narrative account analysing the key events of the Second Cold War, and it's giving you some things you might want to include there. So the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Strategic Defence Initiative. And really interesting, the mark scheme. The target is your analytical narrative, and then they say i.e., so this is what we're looking out for, the cause, the consequence and change. So through this answer, what you are being asked to do is write about the cause, what caused the Second Cold War, what changed in the Second Cold War, and what were those consequences. And then at the bottom there and here, you are limited if you only write about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Strategic Defence Initiative. So you can't access level 3 on the mark scheme, and maximum 4 marks here for answers that do not go beyond aspects prompted by the stimulus points. So I think this is a good answer. I've stuck to a paragraph per 4 marks. So we'll go into it now and then I'll relate it back to the mark scheme. So to safeguard Soviet interests, there needed to be a pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan, the cause. The country shared a border with the USSR, and the USSR had a substantial Muslim population. The background of the Iranian Revolution intensified the concerns around Afghanistan. Therefore, to avert potential official American support, the USSR orchestrated a military invasion and likely orchestrated the assassination of Afghanistan's leader. So there, I've got that. This is what's caused the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan. The USSR remained in Afghanistan for almost a decade. This is what's changed now, which highlights the strategic significance of the region in protecting the interests of communism. And now I'm going on to the consequences. While Carter withdrew from the SALT II negotiations, established the Carter Doctrine, imposed economic sanctions, and boycotted the Moscow Olympics, he was ridiculed by his political rival Reagan for being lenient on communism. The USA's reaction was significant because it ended détente, but because it also ushered in a leader who was more opposed to communism compared to his predecessor. This invasion acted as a catalyst for the onset of the Second Cold War. So unlike the previous question, this one is fluid. We don't mark them separately, so we'll go straight to the next paragraph. So while President Carter toughened action towards the SSR, it was Reagan's political stance that ignited the Second Cold War. And again, look at that word, ignited. I'm talking about the cause. I'm looking at the causes. Reagan described the USSR as an evil empire and took decisive action that ended détente. Reagan knew that the Soviet economy was struggling. The USSR would need to increase the wealth the economy was creating before they could commit to increased military funding. As a result of the USSR's economy, Reagan deliberately sought $1 trillion over a 6-year period. So there, I've got the cause. Why is Reagan asking for money? Now I'm going to go on to what changed. Reagan used this to fund the Strategic Defence Initiative, which he announced in a televised address, further igniting pressure between the two superpowers. Satellites would carry powerful lasers that could shoot down Soviet missiles and prevent them from harming the USA. This was against the terms of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty and was designed because the USSR would not be able to compete with this kind of technology. And there's what's changed. Now it's the consequences. Reagan spoke of SDI as a reality and did not admit the world that the new system was years away from being ready. The SDI and its televised address was a deliberate ending of détente and was completely in line with his campaign promises. So if we go back to the mark scheme there, it says, and remember, AO1 is for your knowledge, what do you remember? And AO2 is for that analytical narrative. How much have I delved into the causes, the changes and the consequences? So let's jump straight to level 3 because that's our target. So a narrative is given which organises the material into a clear sequence of events leading to an outcome. So there definitely is a clear sequence of events here because I've started off chronologically early and I've gone on to much later. The account of event analyses the linkage between them and is coherent and logically structured. So there's definitely a linkage between these two here. An account accurate and relevant information is included, showing good knowledge and understanding of the key features or characteristics of the event. And that there is true. So I hope this answer would get 8 out of 8. The next question, explain 2 of the following. Just as a reminder, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to explain all 3, but actually you only have to pick 2. And again, because it's 8 marks, it's point, evidence explain, and then link that back to the question. And there's some sentence starters that you might wish to use on there. So this is the first example. Explain two of the following: the importance of the Berlin crisis for the development of the Cold War. And I'm going to go through this now, and then after I will link it back to the exam question, which is on there. So the first reason the Berlin crisis was important for the development of the Cold War was that it led to a public breakdown in superpowers over Germany. First, the joining of the western sections into one economic unit known as Bisonia highlighted the strained political relationship between communism and capitalism in a very public way. Second, and this is me now, so my point first of all was the first reason, and this is me now giving evidence. Second, the West German state even introduced a new currency, further confirmation that the two sides were not only different but also competing. And finally, Berlin was under Soviet control because of Berlin's geography. This was a test of power for the Soviets against the West, and therefore Berlin crisis drew out a lot of the competitiveness between the East and the West on the public stage. And now I'm going for that, linking it back to the question. So this shows that the Berlin crisis was important for the development of the Cold War, as it showed the world that communism and capitalism were competing politically, economically, and potentially militarily. So now I'm going to go on to the second. So the second reason the Berlin crisis was important because it led officially to the Federal Republic of Germany, the German Democratic Republic, and later the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. First, the establishment of two separate countries was political confirmation that the two sides were adversaries, they weren't friends. Second, these new countries were in direct competition not only politically and economically, but socially. Finally, the creation of NATO was further confirmation that military action was a real possibility. Therefore, the Berlin crisis created official countries that were in competition together and an institution that encouraged military rivalry. This shows the Berlin crisis was important for the development of the Cold War because it created the foundations for the Cold War to intensify. So, well, probably wouldn't need to write anything more. I could go on and say those foundations are two separate countries, this big military organisation that brings in loads of capitalist countries. But if you look at that for 8 marks, I've already written a lot. You should get away with getting into level 3 there. And if we read level 3, so for AO2, and remember AO2 is always the second order concept, so this one here is consequence, a bit of significance, because the significance, because the question was the importance of the Berlin crisis. So AO2, an explanation is given showing analysis of the importance. It shows a line of reason that is coherent and logically structured. And then AO1 is that knowledge, so accurate and relevant information is included showing good knowledge and understanding of the required features or characteristics of the period studied. So this is your next one. This is Prague, and remember it always says explain two of the following. So you've got to explain the importance of the Prague Springs for the relations between East and West. So, and again, I'm sticking to point, evidence explain, and then linking it back to the question. So firstly, it shed light on Brezhnev's aggressive stance in suppressing any relaxation of communist control. Although the reforms were widely embraced by the Czech people, they also garnered support from the United States. This enabled the USA to initiate anti-communist propaganda through radio broadcasts, revealing their swift efforts to undermine the USSR. Consequently, these reforms posed a clear threat to the USSR's dominance and authority over its satellite states, making them deeply unpopular with Brezhnev. So this is an analysis now. As a result, Brezhnev dispatched a formidable force of 500,000 Warsaw troops to invade Czechoslovakia, exhibiting overt hostility towards the Czech people. The Prague Spring, therefore, so I'm linking it back now, assumes great significance in the East-West relations as it underscores how political rivalry can swiftly escalate into a full-fledged military campaign. This likely explains why the Western nations refrained from mounting a military response of their own. So next one. Second, the Prague Springs played a pivotal role in the establishment of the Brezhnev Doctrine. Brezhnev actions appear to be an aggressive endeavour to assert dominance over Eastern European nations, according to Western leaders. And notice that I haven't gone into a long description of what the Brezhnev Doctrine is. I've just hinted at I know what the Brezhnev Doctrine is, and that's enough. However, the Soviet Union justified the invasion as a necessary measure to safeguard the unity of the communist movement in Europe. Brezhnev effectively thwarted any aspirations for increased liberalism within the countries under the USSR's sphere of influence. Despite political protests from the United States, no direct action was taken, which provided Brezhnev with a sense of security in tightening his grip. Therefore, the Prague Spring was important as it further solidified the presence of the Iron Curtain, effectively dividing the East and the West. So again there, I've linked both of them back to the question. Same mark scheme, it's very generic here. This here, the examiner should read it, put it in level 3, and then I reckon somewhere 7, 8 marks. It's definitely not a 6-mark answer question. And this is the final question, and remember, if you're doing the exam, you don't have to answer all 3 of these, you just have to answer 2. So the final one was explaining the importance of détente for relations between the superpowers in the 1970s. So straight into it. So the significance of détente stemmed from the implementation of SALT 1. And that's completely fine to use the acronym, by the way. You don't have to write it out even the first time. You're in an exam, just get it done. Initially, the 2 dominant powers reached an agreement to halt the production of strategic ballistic missiles. I've made my point. This is now my evidence, where it starts with initially here. Additionally, they agreed to introduce nuclear-armed submarines only as a replacement for outdated intercontinental ballistic missiles. Consequently, this substantial step diminished the likelihood of nuclear warfare, especially in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And now I'm linking it back to the question. Therefore, détente was important for the relations between the superpowers as it reduced the probability of a nuclear conflict. Next paragraph. Another reason why détente played a vital role in superpower relations was due to the Helsinki Accords, a gathering of 33 nations from both NATO and the Warsaw Pact convened with the aim of building upon the cooperative atmosphere fostered by SALT 1. During this meeting, an announcement was made indicating a consensus on 3 areas. Number 1, European borders. Number 2, international cooperation. And number 3, human rights. These agreements represented a significant reduction in tension between the superpowers, effectively addressing previous causes of tension, such as the status of West Germany and freedom of speech. Hence, the Helsinki Accords served as a milestone in de-escalating tensions and fostering a more cooperative atmosphere between the 2 superpowers. So, again, both of these I've linked back to the first. I think out of the 3, this one is I haven't written as well. It probably still will get into level 3. If I'm an examiner, I would give this a level 3 answer. And there's loads of questions about what 2 you should choose when you come to your exam. So just as a reminder, these are the 3 questions that you get. Number 1, number 2, number 3. When you're choosing these 2, quickly just write down some things around the questions that you think you can remember, that you think you know. And then whatever you think you can write the most about, don't worry about which one you like the best. Which one is it that you can write the most about? You should start with that one, then move on to the next one. You can write the most about the next one and then just completely ignore. The worst thing that you can do is change your mind halfway, cross it out and then move on. So just pick one, write about it, pick another one, write about it.